Okay, YouTube, in this module of videos, we're going to be kind of exploring the traditional statistical study, but really focusing on this collection of data that we do when we're trying to make predictions or at least hypotheses about a population. So starting with this little progression here, let's start at the beginning. It says that the first thing we'll always do is identify the variable of interest in the population study. So maybe height, weight, sodium levels, those kind of things. You identify that first, but then we would basically choose a sample that is representative of the population. So what I can tell you is the focus this time is going to be placed on the fact that we want a sample that is representative of the population, because what we're going to be doing is taking that sample from the population essentially, and we're going to be saying, based upon our sample of data here, what can we say about the entire population? And so you want your sample to represent the population accurately, because it's going to affect our decision making about our hypothesis in this population. So what we're going to be doing next is collecting our data and then organizing that data to describe it using statistics like mean, median, mode, standard deviation. But then from that data, we can interpret it, make inferences, and draw conclusions about, you guessed it, the population. So this is all about choosing a group of people to really represent the population very well. And what we're going to focus on basically is how we accurately select a random sample. And so the first place we're going to stop is basically this idea of a random sample. We say that a random sample, in a random sample, each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So if we want to keep our sample as representative of the population as a whole, we don't want to choose people that would overrepresent a particular group within a population. So we're going to choose random samples. And what we're going to look at down here is basically the different types of samples that we could see in a statistical study that we make. And so we're going to want to know the names of these, how they work, and which ones are very random, which ones are less random, and which ones we would use in given situations. So we're going to start with this very first one here, and this is one that I guess you would see often if you were designing your own small study about maybe like drive times or something like that at your workplace. You could say, choose a self-selected sample. So basically for a self-selected sample, basically the members of the population, they volunteer to be in the sample. And so these are people who actively took the time to respond to your survey, which means that it's not very, very random, because all the people who didn't respond, they may have responded differently. So we're going to say that this is somewhat random, but it's on the lesser end of random, this one here. Now, the pinnacle, I would say, I like at least, is a systematic sample. And so we say that a systematic sample, a rule is used to select members of the population. So they give an example here. It says, for instance, selecting every other person. Typically what we do is we say, starting at, say, the random person, draw a number out of a hat, starting at, say, the 23rd person in the population, and then going like every 5th person or every 7th person. If we wanted a certain percentage of the population, we could already figure out this rule ahead of time, so that when we choose, say, every whatever nth person, we get that percentage of the population in our sample. So a systematic sample is like every nth person, every nth person starting at a certain person. Okay, let me fix this here. Person starting at some particular person here, and we could say that this is very random. This is very random because it is very outside of a person's decision-making control here. So now next, we're going to look at a stratified sample. And so if you've ever heard this word stratified, or just the prefix strata, it means that this thing has layers, okay? So we're going to say that in a layered situation, for example here it says a population is divided into smaller groups that share a similar characteristic. So a sample is then randomly selected from each of these groups. And so we could say maybe these people over here are all Democratic, leaning people, and these are all Republican leaning people, and these are all independently leaning people. If we wanted to get a good idea about maybe a law, then perhaps we could take, every 7th person from the Democrats, every 7th person from the Republicans, every 7th person from the Independents, and then get an idea. Or we could say maybe these are all freshmen, these are all sophomores, these are all juniors, leave out the senior class. We want to get an idea from already layered groups. Then what we would do is we would choose people from each layer in the population that we've already pre-selected a division between. So one thing I do want to note here is that a stratified sample, it ensures that every segment of a population is represented. So if you have segmented population or layered populations, then we would say that let's split it up and take people from each one. Now a cluster sample is a little bit different. A cluster sample is a group or a bunch. Okay, when we hear cluster, that's a group of people or a bunch of people. And we say that in a cluster sample or 4-cluster sample, a population is divided into groups called clusters. So you can see our clusters down here. And we say that all of the members in one or more of the clusters is selected. So out of these 3 clustered groups, it looks like we could select this middle group here, and we say everybody in this group is going to be used. Now, an example of this might be that I teach 3 Algebra 2 classes, and I want to get an idea of how my algebra classes feel about a particular, teaching method. Then what I could do is I could say, well, I'm just going to use my second hour, second block or something like that. And so we'd say that with cluster sampling, a member of a population cannot belong to more than one cluster, which is kind of a nice thing, because when you're going to take several samples from an overall population, then perhaps you don't want to select the same person twice, and sometimes you can. Okay, it doesn't matter sometimes, and sometimes it does. And then lastly, we say a convenience sample. This is truly what it sounds like. We just say only members of a population who are easy to reach and are selected there. So we say, conveniently, I want to get an idea of how people feel about the weather today. I could just ask the 10 people who are sitting next to me. That's it. So that would be a convenience sample. So we want to distinguish between these. In terms of stratified, let's list this here. We would say that this is more random. This is more random. Okay, on the spectrum of randomness, stratified is pretty random. We say that this is random. Okay, but I would say on the lesser end of things, because if I'm only asking one class out of all my classes, it's not really representing each person, each class, in the entire population. And then we would say that convenience sample, this is very not random. Okay, not as random. Let's put it that way. Not as random, because you're just choosing the people around you without systematically choosing them. So we want to be able to recognize these. What we're going to do basically in this first example is determine, whether students in your school like the new design of a school's website and identify the type of sample described. So reading through this, we have a new website apparently, and they did a survey. So when they sampled the students in the population, the question is, what kind of sample did they use? So if we were to list all the students alphabetically and then choose every 6th student, looking back at our sampling methods here, we would recognize that this was this kind of every nth person approach. And so we would say that's very systematic in its sampling, and that's what we'll refer to this as. So we'd say this is a systematic sample here because we're choosing every nth person. Letter B here says, well, then what if we mailed the questionnaires and use only the questionnaires that are returned? Which one would this be? So this wouldn't be systematic, but if we mailed it to everybody, I suppose we're representing everybody here now. Did we represent it to layered groups here, or bunches of people? Or was this a convenience sample, or was it self-selected? And out of all of these here, we'd say, well, if we're only using the people that responded, then we're using this kind of somewhat random self-selected sample here. It's not as good as a random sample, well, a systematic sample, but we'd say that this would be a self-selected because basically we're only using the ones that people, kind of volunteered to give us here. So this is a self-selected sample. So letter C, we ask all the students in our algebra class. Okay, so if we're talking about an algebra class, which one of these do we feel like this would be? And so in terms of just looking at a preset class of people, like a bunch of people, we're looking at something that would be more of a cluster-based thing because it's everybody in that already pre-selected group. So here's our bunch of people sample or cluster sample. And then for our last example here, it says we randomly select 2 students from each classroom. And so if we were to select 2 students, but from each already layered group of people, that's that layered sample or stratified sample. So we have strata here, which means layers. So stratified, layered groups here. This is our stratified sample. So what I want you to do is kind of pause the video right now, read through these and see what kind of responses you come up with, and unpause it when you're ready to go. Looking at the solutions now, we'd say in example 1, you divide the students in your school according to their zip code. So we've got them split up by zip code, and then we select all the students that live in one particular zip code. Question was, what type of sample are we using here? Because we're only using one pre-selected group of people, this would be a cluster type of sample. And for part 2 here, it says describe another method you could use to obtain a stratified sample in example 1. Maybe perhaps all the students in our school, if we separated them instead of by zip codes, kind of like I suppose we could do street number. We could select students from each street number there, or we could separate them in terms of stratified. Suppose we could do freshmen. Freshmen would be one group. Sophomores, juniors, and seniors, these would be stratified samples as well if we took people from each group. Okay, cheers.